An officer stopped an ordinary teenager on a quiet street and began to openly abuse him. He didn't believe a word he said, especially when he calmly told him who his father was. But as the black SUV pulled up, the expression on the cop's face changed forever. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching this video from. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the rural two-lane highway that stretched like a ribbon through the outskirts of Spring Hollow, Texas. It was the kind of town where neighbors still waved from their porches, and school football games could be heard on Friday nights from 5 blocks away. Yet, despite its slow charm and gentle facade, the world here was no more innocent than anywhere else. It had its pride, its suspicions, its boundaries, spoken and unspoken. 15-year-old Ryan Norris walked along the shoulder of the road, his backpack slung over one shoulder, a water bottle in one hand, the other tucked into the pocket of his hoodie. His feet carried the familiar ache of hard-earned training, the soles of his sneakers worn from hours of repetition on the dojo's wooden floors. He'd just left the small martial arts studio a mile or so outside of town, a modest converted barn with mats, mirrors, and a creaky locker room that always smelled faintly of liniment and dust. He liked walking home after training. It gave him time to think, to decompress, to let the teachings of the day settle into his muscles and mind. Ryan's pace was steady, neither hurried nor slow. His head was held high, posture straight, as he had been taught. Posture isn't just about fighting, his father had told him once. It's about presence, about showing the world that you're grounded, calm, and not easily shaken. He took that seriously, even when no one was watching, maybe especially then. The breeze picked up, rustling the dry grass at the roadside. Ryan adjusted the strap on his shoulder. The training had been intense. Circuit drills, kata, and sparring that left a bruise blooming just beneath his cheekbone. He didn't mind. The bruise meant he'd learned something. He preferred pain with a purpose to the kind that came without reason. The hum of an approaching car reached his ears, low and steady. He didn't look back at first. Vehicles passed all the time, but as the sound grew closer and then began to slow, the way it crawled rather than drove, something stirred at the base of his spine. He glanced over his shoulder. A black and white cruiser, standard local patrol, the kind you see parked outside gas stations or crawling through school zones. It slowed to a crawl beside him, the driver's side window already rolling down. Ryan took a breath. He stopped walking and turned toward the vehicle, careful not to appear startled or defensive. He pulled the earbuds from his ears. Not that there had been any music playing, not tonight. He preferred silence on nights like these. "Hey, buddy," came the voice from the window, casual but not warm. "Hold up a second." Ryan didn't bristle. He didn't roll his eyes or argue. He had heard the stories, more than stories really. Experiences passed down like family heirlooms among kids who looked like him, even if he wasn't quite like them. The lesson was the same. Stay calm, stay polite, stay alive. He nodded once. "Yes, sir?" The officer behind the wheel was young, maybe late 20s. Crew cut, mirrored sunglasses pushed up on his head despite the setting sun. His name badge read B. Marshall. His expression was that of a man used to being obeyed. But tonight, it was colored with something more. Curiosity, maybe boredom, maybe suspicion. "You live around here?" Marshall asked, his gaze drifting over Ryan's hoodie, his bruised face, and then to the backpack. "Yes, sir. I'm walking home from karate practice." The word karate seemed to hang in the air, almost silly in the mouth of someone who didn't know its weight. Marshall quirked an eyebrow. "Is that right?" he asked. "You got some ID?" "I don't have a license yet," Ryan replied evenly, "but I have a school ID in my bag." He started to reach slowly toward the zipper of his backpack, moving with the kind of exaggerated care that one learns from watching too many videos of things going wrong. But even that wasn't fast enough. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Marshall snapped, his hand drifting toward his belt, toward his sidearm. Ryan froze, fingers inches from the bag. His heart thudded once, hard, but he didn't let the fear show. He slowly lifted his hands, palms out. "It's in the front pocket, sir," he said calmly. Marshall exhaled through his nose, as if annoyed that he had to be the responsible one. He got out of the cruiser, boots crunching the gravel, and circled around to stand in front of Ryan. He was taller than the boy, but only just. Close up, he examined Ryan with narrowed eyes, as if the boy were a puzzle that had to be solved by force. "What's in the bag?" "Just school stuff. My G, gloves, a bottle of water." "Go ahead," Marshall said. Slowly. Ryan set the bag down on the gravel shoulder and unzipped it. Inside, his white training gi, still damp with sweat, fingerless sparring gloves, a bottle of water half drunk, a pair of sneakers. He moved slowly, methodically, laying each item out. Marshall watched like a hawk, eyes flicking over each item. There was no cause for alarm, no weapons, no drugs, just a kid's sports gear. Still, the officer didn't step back. "You got parents at home?" he asked. "Yes, sir. My mom's probably home now." "What about your dad?" The question came with an edge, a curl at the corner of Marshall's mouth that wasn't quite a smile. It wasn't curiosity. It was a jab in the ribs. "He's working," Ryan said. "What does he do?" Ryan hesitated. "Not long. Just enough." "He's a combat instructor, retired military." "Oh, yeah?" Marshall stepped closer. "And what's his name?" Ryan looked him in the eye. "Chuck Norris." It wasn't a boast. It wasn't smug. It was just an answer, as calmly delivered as the others. But it had the opposite effect. Marshall stared at him for a beat. Then he laughed. Not the kind of laugh people share, the kind you throw like a stone. "You're serious?" he said. "That's rich, kid. Chuck Norris, like the movies? Walker? Texas Ranger?" Ryan didn't move. He didn't flinch. He'd seen this reaction before, from kids, from adults, from teachers and strangers. He was used to it. "You expect me to believe you're Chuck Norris's kid?" Marshall chuckled again. "Where's your cowboy hat? You gonna roundhouse kick me?" Ryan didn't answer. He just looked at him, steady and quiet. "Oh, man," Marshall said, shaking his head. "You're not even a good liar. Your dad's Chuck Norris? That's the best you could come up with?" A second cruiser pulled up behind the first. Another officer stepped out, older, quieter, sensing the tension but unsure of what to make of it. He stayed by his car, watching. Marshall called out to him, voice still dripping with mockery. "Hey, Miller, get this. This kid says his dad is Chuck Norris." Miller didn't laugh. He looked at Ryan, then at the gear laid out on the ground, then back at Marshall. Something in his face changed. Not surprise, not recognition, but restraint. He didn't say anything. "You gonna invite me over for dinner with Walker, the Texas Ranger?" Marshall sneered, stepping forward again. "Maybe teach me some kung fu?" Ryan remained still. His jaw clenched slightly, but his eyes didn't change. "You think that name makes you special?" Marshall said. "You think you can just say anything and get away with it?" "No, sir," Ryan said softly. Marshall stood over him for a moment longer, breathing hard. Then, as if bored with the lack of reaction, he stepped back. "Get your stuff. Go home. And next time, don't make up stories. Ryan didn't reply. He packed up his bag, slipping his GI and gloves back inside. He put the bottle away, zipped it up, and stood. He turned, adjusted the strap, and began to walk. Behind him, he heard the laughter again. "Chuck Norris, my ass," Marshall muttered. Ryan didn't look back. He didn't run. He didn't break stride, but inside, his chest was tight. His fists were clenched inside his pockets. His father had told him moments like these would come, had warned him, prepared him, not with paranoia, but with principles. "You don't need to be loud to be strong," his father had said. "You need to know who you are, even when others don't." As Ryan walked down the road, the light fading and the town ahead, he heard the familiar sound of a truck engine behind him. Not the cruiser. Something else. Something that made the air shift. He didn't turn around. Not yet, because he didn't need to look to know. His father was already on his way. The hum of tires on pavement faded into the distance behind him, and Ryan continued walking as if nothing had happened. His heartbeat had returned to normal, but the tightness in his chest lingered, an ache born not of fear but of frustration. He replayed every word in his mind, every sneer, every second of the officer's laughter, like a scene on repeat he couldn't turn off. The air had cooled since the sun began its descent, but Ryan hardly noticed the breeze brushing against his cheeks. The warmth in his body had turned inward, coiling into something heavy and quiet just beneath his ribs. He kept walking, step after step, head high. Behind him, unseen by his eyes, but not by his awareness, a black SUV rolled up the road at a steady pace. It wasn't marked by sirens or arrogance. It didn't demand attention. It simply arrived, the way some forces in life do, not to make a statement, but because they were always going to. It pulled off the road without fuss and came to a stop on the shoulder, 50 feet ahead of Ryan's path. The engine idled for a second before falling silent. Then the driver's door opened. Ryan saw the door swing out from the corner of his eye, but he didn't stop walking. He knew the vehicle, knew the rhythm of the engine and the way the tires sounded over gravel. His steps slowed naturally, the way they might when approaching someone you know is waiting. He didn't rush, didn't break stride. The SUV wasn't there to rescue him. It was there because the moment required it. The man who stepped out stood with the same stillness Ryan had learned to mimic. Jeans, boots, a simple heather gray t-shirt that hugged broad shoulders and strong arms without announcing them. His hair was lighter now than in the posters and TV clips the world remembered, the red fading to silver at the temples. His beard was neatly trimmed. He didn't move toward his son right away. He didn't need to. Chuck Norris simply waited. Ryan approached with quiet steps, stopping a few paces away. He didn't speak. Neither did his father. Their eyes met, two mirrors reflecting the same silent question. "You good?" Ryan gave a small nod. Chuck returned it. Then, without a word, he turned and opened the passenger door. Ryan climbed in. Inside the SUV, the air smelled like leather and cedar, the same faint scent that clung to his father's office at home, to his jackets, to the hallway where old awards and photos lined the walls. The vehicle was as unassuming as its owner, clean but unflashy. Practical. A former military man's idea of nice. As they pulled away from the roadside, the town's distant lights came into view through the windshield. Still, neither of them spoke. They were halfway home before Chuck broke the silence. What happened? Ryan didn't flinch. He stared out the window, watching the familiar curve of the road pass under their wheels. He pulled over, said I looked suspicious. Chuck's hands remained steady on the wheel. Did you give him attitude? No, I answered his questions, told him I was walking home from practice. A pause. He asked who my dad was. Chuck glanced at him, then looked back to the road. And you told him? I did. Another pause. He laughed, Ryan added after a moment. Mocked me, made jokes in front of another cop. People were watching. Chuck said nothing for a while. His silence wasn't distant. It was considering, like a craftsman inspecting damage before choosing the right tool. At a stoplight, he finally turned to his son. You okay? Ryan nodded. You stayed calm? Yes, sir. That's all that matters. They drove the rest of the way home in silence. When they pulled into the driveway, the porch light was on, casting a warm glow on the siding of their modest house. Angela Norris stood just inside the screen door, her silhouette framed by light. She stepped out as they arrived, arms folded but not in judgment, more in readiness. Ryan went inside first, giving his mother a brief look that said enough. Chuck lingered outside a moment, watching the shadows settle in the trees at the end of the street, then followed. That night, after dinner was cleared and the house had quieted, Chuck sat in his home office. The room was small, with clean lines and dark wood furniture. The walls held a few framed photos, his early days in martial arts competitions, behind-the-scenes shots from film sets, a candid of him holding a much younger Ryan on his shoulders in a field of sunflowers. Notably absent were the more performative images the world associated with him. No over-the-top poses. No posters from his most meme-worthy roles. This room wasn't about legend. It was about reality. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, gaze resting not on the computer screen in front of him, but beyond it. He was thinking, not in the way men think about simple solutions, but in the way trained minds think about threats, consequences, and calculated responses. Angela entered without knocking. She didn't need to. He told me what happened, she said quietly. Chuck nodded once. Angela crossed her arms, but this time there was heat in her posture. He was mocked, Chuck. That cop humiliated him on the side of the road, called him a liar. I know. You know he held it together, right? I do. He didn't flinch. He didn't lash out. He kept control. Chuck looked up at her. Because we taught him how. Angela's shoulders dropped slightly, not with resignation, but with something closer to pride. He listens. He's starting to understand, Chuck said, leaning forward. It's not about defending your name. It's about knowing who you are when others don't. She studied him a moment longer. What are you thinking? Chuck turned to his computer. That this cop, Marshall, he'll talk, he'll laugh, he'll think it's funny. And maybe that's the end of it, but maybe it's not. Angela stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. You're not going to escalate. No, Chuck said simply, but I won't let it repeat. Meanwhile, word of the roadside incident began to ripple through town. Not because of official channels, but because of a 15-second video uploaded to social media by a passing driver. In the clip, blurry but unmistakable, a teenage boy was seen standing on the side of the road, backpack open, being questioned by a young officer. The laughter caught on the audio was sharp and unmistakably cruel. The words, "Chuck Norris, that's rich kid," were audible just before the video cut off. The footage spread fast. Locals commented first, then strangers. The boy's face wasn't fully clear, but the circumstances were. Within hours, speculation bloomed in the comment sections. Was it really his father? Was this real? Was it just another hoax? Then someone found Ryan's old competition photos. Others recognized Chuck's truck, parked at the dojo on certain evenings. Pieces clicked into place, and the narrative turned. At the police department, Marshall was still laughing about the encounter until a senior officer called him into a back room and showed him the video. His face changed, not from guilt, but from fear. In the eyes of the public, he'd mocked a child. Worse, he'd mocked a child whose father happened to be a public icon and one of the most respected martial artists in the country. The department scrambled to issue a vague statement about ongoing internal review and community engagement efforts. But it was too late. The fire had caught. The next morning, reporters called the high school. Students whispered in hallways. A local news van idled across from the Norris home, camera pointed passively at the front yard. Angela kept the blinds closed. Chuck told Ryan to stay home for the day. Ryan spent that morning in the backyard, hidden the punching bag that hung from the old oak tree. Each strike was precise, measured. His knuckles ached, but he didn't stop. It wasn't anger that drove him. It was clarity. Each strike was a statement. I know who I am. I don't need anyone to believe me. Inside, Chuck watched from the kitchen window, his arms crossed. He didn't interrupt. The boy was working something out, and no man had the right to rush that process. He saw the way Ryan moved now, more than technique. It was control, presence, dignity. He saw himself, and he knew. The world was going to see, too, whether it was ready or not. The following days unfolded with an unsettling quiet, like the stillness before a summer storm. Spring Hollow didn't do controversy well. It was a town built on routines and polite smiles, on neighbors waving from across fences and school board meetings that rarely lasted more than an hour. But now, something trembled beneath the surface. The video of the roadside stop had spread further than anyone anticipated. What had begun as a small clip taken by a passing driver had rippled outward, amplified by the sheer improbability of the boy's claim and the thunderous validation of its truth. In the video, the officer's derision was clear. So was Ryan's silence, his restraint, his presence. It was only a few seconds long, but it was enough for viewers to see the imbalance, enough to provoke questions. The comments came in waves: disbelief, outrage, sarcasm, support. Some dismissed it as another overblown internet moment. Others demanded the officer's suspension. A few, inevitably, blamed the boy. But the ones who mattered most, those who knew the town, who knew the family, watched with uneasy recognition. Because what the video showed wasn't just a cop mocking a kid. It was the mask slipping. It was the truth coming into view. At the Spring Hollow Police Department, Officer Bradley Marshall was called into the captain's office less than 24 hours after the video hit local news. He walked in with a swagger he hadn't yet learned to rein in, expecting at most a slap on the wrist, maybe a lecture about optics. What he got instead was a terse statement. He was being placed on administrative leave pending internal review. Effective immediately. Badge and firearm, please. Marshall's jaw tightened. He handed them over, but his pride refused to leave with them. As he walked past the bullpen, his fellow officers didn't meet his eye. A few turned away. One, a veteran sergeant, muttered something inaudible, laced with scorn. Marshall left the building with a hot flush on his neck, a mix of shame and disbelief. He didn't think it was overblown. He thought it was ridiculous. Over a name, over a look, over a kid. Meanwhile, in the Norris household, the mood remained measured, controlled. The storm had arrived, but no one inside was panicking. Angela continued working remotely for a few days, wary of news vans and neighborhood gossip. Chuck kept a low profile. He answered no calls from reporters. He gave no statements. He did not go live on Instagram or issue videos demanding justice. That wasn't his way. He understood better than most that noise fades quickly, but presence, that lingers. Ryan spent most of his time in the backyard, training, reading, thinking. He went nowhere alone, not out of fear, but discipline. He remained still amid the whirl of commentary, the classmates whispering his name down hallways, the offers from talk shows and viral content creators who wanted to hear his side. He said no, politely, firmly. This wasn't a spectacle to him. It wasn't a moment to capitalize on. It was something more personal. It was about control. But not everyone stayed silent. 3 days after the video went viral, Chuck agreed to a private meeting with the principal and superintendent of Ryan's high school. The conversation was brief, direct. They were not asking for appearances or statements. They simply wanted to know what could be done to ensure Ryan felt safe and supported. Chuck appreciated the gesture, but as he made clear, his son wasn't afraid. "He doesn't need protection," Chuck said. "He needs dignity." The principal offered to let Ryan speak at the next student assembly, share his experience, reclaim the narrative. Chuck said he'd leave that choice to his son. Ryan declined the assembly, not because he was afraid to speak, but because the words weren't ready yet. Instead, he kept moving, kept practicing. The punching bag in the backyard swung with new rhythm, each strike sharper than the last. At night, he reviewed footage of his tournaments. He reread old journals filled with his father's handwritten notes, breathing techniques, self-defense drills, philosophical fragments that echoed ancient discipline. The body is loud. The mind must be quiet. He was learning what that meant. And slowly, change began to creep into the town. Subtle at first. Mr. Delgado, the owner of the neighborhood hardware store, who'd once stared a bit too long when Ryan walked in alone, now greeted him by name. Mrs. Pritchard, who ran the front desk at the local clinic, stopped Angela to say she'd seen the video. That it had made her think. That maybe the world wasn't as safe for boys like Ryan as she'd thought. Angela had smiled, grateful but wary. Words were easy. Understanding took more. The dojo where Ryan trained had never been particularly busy. A few regulars, kids with too much energy, adults looking for a hobby. But now, new students began trickling in. Teenagers who'd never considered martial arts before. Younger kids accompanied by nervous parents who watched with quiet admiration. Ryan didn't say much to them. He didn't have to. His presence spoke louder than lectures. One afternoon, as he finished a set of kata under the watchful eye of Sensei Inoue, a younger boy approached him. 11, maybe 12, eyes wide, mouth uncertain. "You're him," the boy said, "from the video." Ryan didn't reply. He nodded. "My dad says you're a hero," the boy added. Ryan shook his head. "I'm not." The boy frowned. "But you didn't cry. You didn't yell. You just stood there, like you weren't afraid." Ryan looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "Being calm doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you don't let fear decide who you are." The boy didn't fully understand, but he nodded anyway. The next day, he returned for class. And the next. Back at home, Chuck and Angela spoke little about the growing storm. They didn't need to. Angela managed the practicals, calls from school, emails from concerned parents, meetings with local organizers. Chuck managed the message, or rather the lack of one. When approached by a prominent news anchor for a televised interview, he refused. "My son's dignity isn't a trending topic," he told them. Instead, Chuck focused on what came next. He met quietly with a small group of local community leaders, men and women he trusted, pastors, teachers, retired military, people who understood that change started not in headlines but in habits. Together, they began sketching the outline of a new initiative: a youth leadership program, martial arts, mentorship, community service, a place where boys like Ryan, and unlike him, could learn presence, not just performance. They called it Strength Without Fury. Ryan wasn't thrilled at first. He wasn't looking to be a symbol, but Chuck explained it wasn't about symbols, it was about seeds, planting the idea that dignity could be taught, that control could be learned, that you didn't have to yell to be heard. Ryan agreed to help. Quietly, behind the scenes. The program launched in a borrowed church gymnasium on a Saturday morning. No press, no announcement, just flyers and word of mouth. That first day, 7 kids showed up. By the end of the month, there were 20. Not everyone was happy about it. Online, some voices muttered about favoritism, about media manipulation, about celebrity justice. But they didn't live in Spring Hollow. They didn't see what was happening. They didn't see Mrs. Carter, who had once crossed the street to avoid teenagers in hoodies, now sitting on folding chairs watching her grandson practice sidekicks. They didn't see Officer Miller, the one who had been there on the roadside, step into the gym one evening and ask if he could volunteer. He never said the words aloud, but Ryan heard them anyway. One evening, as the sun fell behind the oaks and the gym began to empty, Chuck stood by the door, arms crossed, watching his son finish a set of forms with 3 younger boys. His stance was strong, his rhythm measured, his presence unmistakable. A quiet pride settled in Chuck's chest, not just the pride of a father, but of a teacher who knew the student had surpassed the lesson. Angela approached with a water bottle and a knowing look. "He's changing," she said softly. Chuck nodded. "He's becoming who he already was." She looked at him. "You taught him that." Chuck shook his head. He listened. "That's harder." In the corner, Ryan helped one of the boys adjust his belt, his voice low and patient. The boy beamed. In that small moment, without cameras, without hashtags, without headlines, something stronger than anger passed between them. It was respect, earned, lived, shared. And somewhere, across town, in a 1-bedroom apartment above a pawn shop, Bradley Marshall sat on a torn couch, watching the footage of the gym on local news. The sound turned low. He held a beer in one hand, his badge still locked in the drawer beside the television. The look on his face was not rage. It was confusion, disbelief, the quiet realization that something had shifted, not just in public opinion, but in him. He hadn't lost to a name, he'd lost to presence. And it burned. The storm hadn't passed, but the winds had changed, and Spring Hollow would never be the same again. The gym lights buzzed faintly above Ryan's head, casting a soft white glow across the worn wooden floor. It was Saturday morning, and already the room echoed with the rhythmic thuds of padded feet meeting mat, soft grunts of effort, and the occasional barked instruction from one of the assistant instructors. Ryan stood near the center of the room, guiding a pair of younger students through a sequence of footwork drills. He moved slowly, deliberately, watching their form, offering quiet corrections. He wasn't the center of attention, nor did he want to be, but his presence was felt, even when he said little. Over the past month, Strength Without Fury had transformed from a whispered experiment into something more tangible. What had started as a small gathering of curious kids and cautious parents had become a regular, structured program. Word spread quickly, but not in the way of viral trends or news clips. It spread the way trust did, in living rooms at church functions over coffee in quiet kitchens. Parents who had seen the video of Ryan's roadside stop now brought their sons and daughters to learn under the same boy who had stood there with composure and silence. They didn't come because of Chuck. They came because of Ryan. He was reluctant to admit it, but things were changing. At school, the stares had turned into nods. Teachers greeted him with a different kind of recognition, not because they suddenly liked him more, but because he had made them pause. Classmates approached him less with gossip and more with curiosity, and not all of it was pleasant. There were still whispers, still sideways glances, still people who thought his name was the only reason people listened. But something inside Ryan had shifted too. He no longer walked through the halls trying to be invisible. He didn't shrink from the glances. He didn't retreat from the awkward moments. He faced them, steady as ever. Not because he had anything to prove, but because he'd come to understand that dignity wasn't something others granted. It was something you carried. After the morning session, as the younger students filtered out with water bottles and folded uniforms in hand, Ryan stayed behind to clean up. He swept the mats, stacked the pads, checked the sign-in sheets. It was habit now, part of the rhythm. When he finished, he went outside to sit on the steps leading to the parking lot, the sunlight warm against his skin. Across the lot, his father stood under the shadow of a tree, speaking with a pair of local coaches. They were planning a self-defense seminar, one of several upcoming events designed to open the gym to more of the community. Chuck's voice was low, his tone patient. He never pitched or persuaded. He just explained. And more often than not, people listened. As Ryan watched, a familiar figure approached from the side. It was a boy from his school, Dayon Waller. Dayon had been in his math class last year, sat near the back, rarely spoke unless called on. They hadn't talked much beyond group projects and casual nods in the hallway, but what Ryan remembered most was the look Dayon had given him after the video went viral. Not mocking, not admiring, but something in between. Curious, unsettled. Now, Dayon walked up, hands in his pockets, gaze low. "Hey," he said. Ryan looked up. "Hey." Dayon hesitated. "You got a second?" Ryan nodded, motioning for him to sit. Dayon dropped onto the step beside him, not too close but not distant either. "I saw your thing," Dayon said after a moment. "That video, the cop, all of it." Ryan didn't reply right away. Dayon continued, "I used to think you were just one of those kids. Quiet 'cause you thought you were better than everybody." Ryan gave a small smile. "I'm just quiet." "Yeah, I get that now." Dayon glanced sideways at him. "I just wanted to say sorry." "For what?" "For thinking you were fake, for talking trash, for not saying anything when others did." Ryan looked at him. "Why now?" Dayon shrugged. "Because you didn't flinch, you didn't yell, you didn't swing, you just stood there. And I think that's the hardest thing to do. My brother would have swung, I probably would have too." Ryan nodded slowly. "It's not easy." "Yeah," Dayon muttered, "but it mattered." They sat for a while, the sun warming their backs, the hum of passing cars in the distance. Eventually, Dayon stood. "You're doing something here," he said. "That's cool." He walked off without waiting for acknowledgement. Ryan watched him go, then turned back toward the street. It wasn't the first apology he'd received. It wouldn't be the last. But each one added something, like bricks in a wall he hadn't known he was building. At home that evening, over dinner, Angela remarked how quiet the town had become. The reporters had long since packed up, their attention shifted to newer scandals and fresher outrage. But the story had lingered in Spring Hollow, not in headlines, but in people's minds. The police department had hosted 2 town hall meetings since the incident. Officer Miller had spoken at one, offering a quiet but pointed criticism of how things were handled. Officer Marshall, on the other hand, had gone silent. He hadn't returned to the force. Rumor had it he was considering legal action, but no one had seen him in weeks. "Are you okay if he comes back?" Angela asked Ryan. Ryan paused, considering. "I don't care," he said at last. "He doesn't matter anymore." Chuck raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Ryan looked at him. "Yeah, because whatever he says, whatever he thinks, it doesn't change what I did, or who I am." Angela smiled, pride and caution mingling in her eyes. The next day, Ryan was called into the school counselor's office. Mrs. Young was a well-meaning woman in her early 50s who always wore cardigans and kept peppermint candies on her desk. She offered him one before beginning. He declined. "I wanted to ask if you'd consider speaking at the next assembly," she said. Ryan blinked. "Why?" "Well," she said, "after everything that happened, a lot of students have been talking. Some feel inspired, some feel confused, some are angry. I think hearing from you might help." Ryan considered the idea. Public speaking wasn't something he enjoyed, but he understood the power of presence now, the value of being seen. Maybe he didn't need to say much. Maybe he just needed to be honest. He agreed. The day of the assembly arrived under gray skies and a thick layer of spring humidity. The gymnasium was packed. Students in folding chairs, teachers along the walls, administrators near the stage. Ryan sat off to the side, waiting as the principal introduced a few speakers, a counselor, a teacher, a coach. Then his name was called. He walked up slowly, took his place at the podium, adjusted the microphone. He didn't have a written speech, just a handful of thoughts he'd practiced in his head while shadowboxing in the mirror. "I'm not here to talk about what happened to me," he began. "You've seen the video, you've heard the jokes, you've read the comments. That part's done." He scanned the room, met a few eyes. "I'm here to talk about what you do when people don't believe you, when they think you're lying, or stupid, or trying to be something you're not." He paused. "You stay calm. You stay true. You don't let them decide who you are." More silence. "My dad taught me that strength isn't about yelling or fighting. It's about being the same person, even when someone tries to tear you down. It's about knowing you matter, even if they don't think you do." He looked out over the rows of students. Some were watching intently. Some avoided his gaze. That was okay. "So that's all I'm going to say. Don't be loud to prove something. Be solid, be steady, and keep your head up." He stepped down to scattered applause. It wasn't thunderous, but it was real. Later that week, he sat with his father on the porch steps, the sun setting behind them. "You handled that well," Chuck said. Ryan nodded. "I didn't want to lecture them." "You didn't," Chuck replied. "You showed them." Angela joined them with a pair of cold drinks. "You know," she said, "you've got the start of something here." "I don't want to be anyone's symbol," Ryan muttered. "You're not," Chuck said. "You're a reminder. And that's even more important." The next morning, as Ryan returned to the gym for another weekend session, he found that the class list had grown again. A few familiar names, a few surprises, and at the end of the sign-in sheet, written in slightly shaky penmanship, was one name that made him pause. D. Waller. He smiled. Change was coming. Not fast, not easy, but real. And he would meet it the only way he knew how. With control, with presence, with dignity. The wind that moved through Spring Hollow that morning was slow and warm, carrying with it the scent of early summer, fresh grass, distant grills, and the sweet, earthy perfume of blooming trees. In the quiet cul-de-sac where the Norris family lived, the stillness felt earned, not the silence of avoidance or fear, but of calm after a long season of noise. On the cracked basketball court in the driveway, Ryan stood at the free throw line, bouncing the ball in his hands. He exhaled softly, knees bent, shoulders loose. The ball lifted from his fingertips with the kind of grace that comes only from repetition, arcing perfectly through the hoop with a soft swish. He moved to retrieve it, then began the next sequence. Jab, step, cross. One dribble, rise, shoot. The ball kissed the backboard and dropped in. The rhythm was meditative, almost ceremonial. It was no longer about practice. It was about remembering who he was, even when no one watched. Inside the house, Chuck stood in the kitchen, 2 mugs in hand. He passed one to Angela, who was seated at the counter, scanning a list of upcoming events for Strength Without Fury. The program had grown faster than either of them had expected. The waiting list for summer enrollment stretched beyond what the facility could currently hold. Parents from neighboring counties were calling, asking if their kids could come down. Local teachers were referring students they believed needed more than what the classroom could offer. And there was Ryan, out there in the driveway, moving like a tide, quiet, steady, certain. Angela sipped her tea, then glanced out the window. They want him to speak at graduation. Chuck raised an eyebrow. The school? Angela nodded. Principal's idea. Said they've never had a sophomore be asked, but this year's different. Chuck didn't answer right away. He looked out toward the driveway. Ryan had just sunk another shot and was chasing down the rebound with patient steps. Has he said anything about it? Chuck asked. He's thinking. That evening, over dinner, Ryan mentioned it casually between bites. They asked if I'd say something at the ceremony. Chuck and Angela exchanged a glance, then turned their attention to him. He shrugged. I don't know. I'm not graduating. Feels weird. Angela leaned forward slightly. It's not about graduation. It's about who people listen to. They shouldn't listen to me, Ryan said. I just stood still. You didn't just stand still, Chuck replied. You stood with purpose. Ryan didn't argue. He just nodded slightly, pushing the food around on his plate. I was thinking about saying yes, he said after a while, but only if I can speak honestly. No speeches, no applause lines, just me. Chuck smiled. That's exactly why they asked you. Later that week, a woman Ryan didn't recognize knocked at the front door. She was in her 60s, hair silver and curled, wearing a floral dress and white sneakers. In her hands, she held a Tupperware container and a folded envelope. When Angela answered, the woman introduced herself as Mrs. Whitaker from down the block. They'd never spoken before, though Ryan had passed her house dozens of times on his walks home. I wanted to bring something for your boy, Mrs. Whitaker said, holding out the container. Just cookies, nothing fancy. And this, she added, offering the envelope. It's a letter. To him. To say I'm sorry. Angela accepted both with gentle hands. She didn't need to ask what the apology was for. It wasn't an uncommon thing these days. Not everyone had come forward, but many had, in their own awkward, halting ways. That night, Ryan opened the envelope alone in his room. The handwriting was neat but shaky. Dear Ryan, I've lived in this neighborhood for almost 40 years. I've seen children grow, families move, houses change colors. I've also seen things I didn't understand. And I've made assumptions I never should have made. I watched you walk by my house many times. I never waved. I told myself it was caution. I think now it was fear. But I saw you that day, and I saw the way you handled it. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't run. You just stood, and it changed something in me. I'm sorry I didn't see you before. I see you now. Thank you for your strength. Sincerely, Agnes Whitaker. Ryan folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and set it in the drawer with his journals. He didn't mention it at dinner. Some things didn't need to be shared to be understood. The morning of the graduation ceremony arrived with clear skies and the sound of birds calling from the rooftops. The gymnasium was full, chairs lined up in precise rows, parents fanning themselves with programs, students straightening gowns. Ryan sat near the back, not in a gown, but in a crisp white shirt and black slacks. He hadn't wanted to be seated on stage. He didn't like the elevation. Instead, he asked to walk up from the floor when it was time. Principal Gutierrez called him to the podium just after the valedictorian finished her speech. The applause was polite but curious. Some parents didn't know who he was. Others knew all too well. Ryan stepped onto the stage and took his place behind the microphone. He didn't look nervous. He didn't glance down at notes. He stood the same way he had on the side of the road weeks earlier, rooted, composed, present. I was asked to speak today, he began, not because I'm graduating, but because something happened this year, something that a lot of people saw, and a lot of people had opinions about. He paused. I've heard a lot of things since then, that I was brave, that I was lucky, that I was just trying to get attention. Maybe all of those are true in some way. Maybe none are. He looked out at the audience. No theatrics, just steady eye contact. But here's what I learned. When someone looks at you and doesn't see you, when they decide who you are before you say a word, you have a choice. You can fight back. You can run. Or you can stand still. You can let them see your silence, your presence. He let the words settle. I didn't stand still that day because I was strong. I stood still because I was taught how, by my father, by my mother, by every person who reminded me that dignity isn't given. It's carried. He stepped back, nodded once, walked off stage. The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was deep, resonant, earned. After the ceremony, Ryan waited outside near the oak tree by the parking lot. One by one, classmates came up to shake his hand, some awkwardly, some with real gratitude. A few parents thanked him. A younger student hugged him and ran off before he could respond. Maya Thompson, a senior on the school newspaper, snapped his photo and asked for a quote. He declined politely. I've said enough for today. That night, the Norris family gathered in the living room with pizza and sparkling water. No speeches, no fanfare. Just the three of them and the dog curled on the rug. Chuck raised his glass. To the kid who stood still. They clinked glasses. Ryan smiled. The summer brought new opportunities. A regional news station ran a quiet feature on strength without fury. A nearby town requested Chuck and Ryan to consult on a youth outreach program. A retired general sent a personal letter to Chuck, thanking him for raising a young man who had reminded people that honor still had a place in everyday life. But the moment that meant the most came in July when an elderly man named Mr. Danielson arrived at the gym carrying a wooden box. He'd been a teacher at the local high school in the 1970s and now lived in a nearby assisted living home. I found this in my attic, he told Chuck. Thought maybe your son should see it. Inside the box was a yellow newspaper clipping from 1968. The headline read, "Local student breaks barrier at State Military Academy." The photograph showed a young black man standing stiffly in uniform, flanked by classmates. He looked proud and alone. Chuck held the photo for a long moment, then passed it to Ryan. "First steps," Mr. Danielson said, his voice rough but steady. "They always feel the hardest, but they make the next ones easier." Ryan looked at the photo again. He saw strength there. Not loud, not bold, just standing, just being. He nodded. "We'll frame it." A few days later, the photo hung in the front room of the gym next to a simple plaque. Beneath it, the inscription read, "Legacy isn't what you say. It's what you stand for, even when no one believes you." As summer deepened and new students poured into the gym, Ryan continued to teach, to train, to learn. He was no longer just the son of someone famous. He was someone people looked to, not because of who his father was, but because of who he had become. And as he walked the streets of Spring Hollow, past Mrs. Whitaker's house, past the school, past the old roadside where it all began, he did so not with a need to be seen, but with the quiet understanding that he already was. Because some names open doors, but only presence builds the home inside. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out the next video and explore others on the channel. And if this resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.